Hey all, Glenn Kirshner here. So in the month of July, I think we saw some progress on the justice front. The month started with the testimony of Cassidy Hutchinson. Miss Hutchinson brought us inside the White House on January 6th. And the month of July ended with mounting data points supporting the conclusion that a federal grand jury is criminally investigating the conduct of Donald Trump. So I think we're getting there, friends. Here is a short recap of the legal stories for the month that was July 2022. To testify or not to testify, that is now the question for former White House counsel Pat Cipolloni. Let's talk about that, because justice matters. So in the most recent January 6th public hearing, we heard some evidence that I think qualifies as smoking gun evidence, but we also heard about some things that I think represent loaded gun evidence. And those two kinds of evidence need to be handled very differently by law enforcement. Let's talk about that, because justice matters. So if Attorney General Merrick Garland is truly concerned with the legitimacy of the Department of Justice, there is only one thing that must be done. Let's talk about that, because justice matters. So the month of June was actually pretty historic. It opened with us learning about the schedule for the January 6th committee public hearings, and it ended with those hearings revealing that Donald Trump knowingly and intentionally launched an armed attack on the U.S. Capitol on January 6th. Here's a short recap of the legal stories for the month that was June 2022. So the Supreme Court has already taken some of our constitutional rights away from us, and they're preparing to take more. And they will if we let them. So what say we don't let them? Let's talk about that, because justice matters. Well, down in Georgia, it looks like it's subpoena palooza. John Eastman, come on down. Rudy, Jenna, we've got subpoenas for you as well. And Lindsey Graham, there's a Georgia state subpoena with your name on it. Let's talk about what it all means, because justice matters. So former White House counsel Pat Cipolloni has finally agreed to testify before the January 6th committee investigating the insurrection. Does that mean, at long last, he will stop covering up the crimes of Donald Trump? We'll see. Let's talk about that, because justice matters. Boy, a lot of breaking developments today on the J6 front. Seems like all of a sudden, everybody wants to testify. Former White House counsel Pat Cipolloni testifies for 8 hours to the J6 committee. Steve Bannon is trying to negotiate a deal where he would appear and testify before Congress. And now, even Stewart Rhodes, head of the Oath Keepers, is trying to find a way to save his skin, and he's talking about testifying. You know, when it's all in the history books, today might prove to be a really bad day for Donald Trump. Let's talk about that, because justice matters. So Donald Trump is now colluding with his old criminal associate Steve Bannon, trying to help Bannon gin up what is obviously a bogus defense to Bannon's upcoming criminal trial for contempt of Congress. Let's talk about that, because justice matters. So regarding Steve Bannon's upcoming criminal trial for contempt of Congress, stick a fork in him. He's done. Let's talk about that, because justice matters. So with the latest January 6th committee public hearings, we see, on the one hand, more evidence of Donald Trump's crimes, but we see, on the other hand, indications of firmly entrenched unfairness and injustice. Let's talk about that, because justice matters. You know, friends, there are real dangers associated with witness tampering. But you know what? There are even greater dangers associated with a failure of law enforcement to aggressively investigate witness tampering. Let's talk about that, because justice matters. So in criminal law, there are different kinds of conspiracies. What kind of conspiracy, what model of criminal conspiracy best characterizes what Donald Trump and his criminal cabal have been up to? Let's talk about that, because justice matters. So, friends, have you heard the one about the Secret Service deleting its text messages from January 5 and January 6th, right around the time of the insurrection? It's quite a tale. Let's talk about it, because justice matters. So, Senator Lindsey Graham is trying to avoid having to testify about the crimes of Donald Trump. A sitting United States senator is trying to use the legal process, use the courts, to continue to conceal evidence of Donald Trump's crimes. Let that sink in, and then let's talk about it, because justice matters. So Steve Bannon's trial for criminal contempt of Congress kicks off tomorrow in federal district court in Washington, D.C. What can we expect? Let's talk about that, because justice matters. So I spent today in federal district court in Washington, D.C. watching jury selection in Steve Bannon's criminal contempt of Congress case. And based on what I saw, it feels like Steve Bannon is going to have a rough go of it. And that's a good thing, because justice matters. So as Steve Bannon's contempt of Congress trial progresses, things are not getting appreciably better for old three shirts to the wind Steve Bannon. Let's talk about that, because justice matters. Steve Bannon likes to talk. So tomorrow is Steve Bannon's big day. He gets to take the stand in his own defense at his own criminal trial and tell his side of the story. What are the odds that Bannon testifies? Let's talk about that, because justice matters. So, friends, day 4 of Steve Bannon's criminal contempt of Congress trial was a doozy. Let's talk about it, because justice matters. Steve Bannon guilty of 2 counts of contempt of Congress. Let's talk about that, because justice matters. So Donald Trump is still out there holding his hate rallies and peddling the big election lie, which prompts just one question. When will Donald Trump be charged with his crimes? Let's talk about that, because justice matters. So when our democracy is on fire, is following the facts and following the law wherever they lead the only law enforcement approach? Is it the best law enforcement approach? Let's talk about that, because justice matters. So let's talk subpoenas. Mike Pence's former chief of staff, Mark Short, got one and just testified to a federal grand jury in Washington, D.C. And now it looks like Ginny Thomas may be in line to get a subpoena from the J6 House Select Committee. Let's talk about that, because justice matters. So Attorney General Merrick Garland just gave an interview to Lester Holt of NBC News, and he reaffirmed that the Department of Justice intends to hold everyone accountable for any and all crimes they committed in connection with the insurrection, regardless of who they are, regardless of their status or their position. And Attorney General Garland also made clear that they will hold people accountable in a way that honors the Constitution. Let's talk about precisely what that means, because justice matters. So things are heating up, and they're heating up in the worst way possible for Donald Trump. Let's hope they're also heating up in the best way possible for we the people, for accountability, for the rule of law, and for the future of our democracy. Let's talk about that, because justice matters. So Trump flunkies continue to pop back up as the January 6th House Select Committee investigates the crimes of Donald Trump, as a federal grand jury investigates all things insurrection. Let's talk about the most recent Trump lackey who has resurfaced, because justice matters. Is the Department of Justice criminally investigating Donald Trump? To answer that question, we need to talk about the two most common ways grand jury investigations get opened or initiated. So let's talk about that, because justice matters. I am thrilled to get some time to sit down today and talk with John Boniface. He's the president of a nonprofit organization called Free Speech for People, and they are doing remarkable work.
And Glenn, thank you for having me. I'm happy to be with you.
So now we've learned that the January 6th text messages of Trump's top Department of Homeland Security officials, Chad Wolf and Ken Cuccinelli, have vanished. You know, friends, these text messages might have been deleted, but remember the old saying, there's more than one way to skin a cat or a wolf. Let's talk about that, because justice matters.